I would like to welcome you all to When the Harvest Comes, a conversation with Denne Michele Norris and Dr. Roxane Gay. Dr. Gay is the Gloria Steinem Endowed Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies here at Rutgers University. This chair is a collaboration between the Institute for Women's Leadership, the School of Communication and Information, and the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department. This chair addresses the intersections between media, culture, and social change. Dr. Gay is an internationally recognized writer, editor, cultural critic, and educator, known for her work Bad Feminist, Hunger, Difficult Women, and many more, and I have the honor of being her student. We all have unruly bodies is the sweeping statement Dr. Gay began our first class with, and it's the structure that has shaped our writing all semester. The course, Writing Unruly Bodies, is not only challenging because the Roxane Gay reads my writing, but she asks us to investigate what it means to live in a trans body, a Black body, a disabled body, an incarcerated body, bodies that have rules forced upon them. Dr. Gay advises us to look both inwardly and outward, to find perspective from within and the world around us. And our guest author here tonight is Denne Michele Norris. Her debut novel, When the Harvest Comes, begins with Davis, a young Black gay man estranged from his father, as he faces his future on his wedding day. He is forced to reckon with the familial wounds of his past, the impossible expectations of Black masculinity, the struggles of his interracial relationship, and the boundlessness of love. Norris explores how our childhood can still catch up with us in adulthood through this epic love story between two queer men. Norris is the editor-in-chief of Electric Literature, winner of the 2022 Whiting Literacy magazine, and is the first Black openly trans woman to have a major literary publication. She is known for her short stories Last Rites, Daddy's Boy, and Where Every Boy is Known and Loved. At the end of the event, stay tuned for a book signing of When the Harvest Comes. Reading and publishing work like these two incredible writers is especially important in a time as terrifying as this. They ground us in the unspoken realities and truths that challenge us to listen rather than assume, to lean into our uncomfortability, and to lavish in their artful craft. Which brings us to tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Roxane Gay and Denne Michele Norris for a reading and conversation on When the Harvest Comes.
Thank you, May, for that very generous introduction. You know, you teach and you talk to your students and you always wonder if it's getting in there because they're so busy. They have so much going on. And clearly it does. It's amazing. I'm awesome. But it's a real pleasure to be here tonight in conversation with Denne to talk about, is it Denne or Denne Michele?
Denne Michele.
To talk with Denne Michele about her gorgeous, gorgeous novel, When the Harvest Comes. I've been reading this novel for the past couple weeks and savoring it. I could have torn through it because it's that readable, but I just wanted to sit in the very sensual and beautiful and emotional moments. And so I would love for you guys to hear a bit of the novel. And so she's going to read for us a bit. And then we'll, have some chit chat.
Thank you. And thanks so much for that wonderful introduction. It's really an honor to be here. You guys are my first stop on this book tour. So we're kicking it off and it feels really special. So thank you for having me. I'm going to read a little bit from one of the early chapters of the book, chapter 3. And at this point, all you really need to know is that Davis and Everett, this is their wedding day. And Davis has just woken up. Everett is still asleep. And Davis has promised Everett that for their week of their wedding, he would not touch his viola, but he brought his viola. And since Everett is asleep, he's preparing to do a little bit of practicing. For Davis, scales and arpeggios are like daily meditation. He can quiet his mind, turn his attention to observing, which is different from thinking. The stillness of his body, contrasted with the quick dexterity of his fingers, has a way of calming him, bringing steadiness. Davis had tried explaining this on their second date. Everett, who'd worn a deep blue button-down tucked neatly into gray flat front slacks, had laughed at the thought of playing scales every day. Don't you get bored of them? A question that normally might have hurt or offended Davis instead amused him. He doesn't know the way his eyes glinted having caught an errant ray from the restaurant's lighting. He doesn't know how his sudden smile, joyful yet slightly condescending, managed to capture the most tender sort of happiness that Everett had ever seen. What Davis does know, what he remembers, is how quickly he shook his head, how he leaned forward and really looked Everett in the eye. His boldness in that moment still delights him. He almost knocked his fork to the ground as he tried to explain the joy of scales, the beauty in setting aside time every day to go back to the beginning, to lose yourself in rote practice. Think of it like this. On a playground, you've got your slide, your tire swing, your seesaw, your jungle gym. They're bolted to the ground. They never move. One day, I slide down the slide. Then I run over to the tire swing, sit on top of it, and swing around in big, lopsided circles. Then I climb into the jungle gym where I crawl through the yellow plastic tube, but not the red plastic tube with the right angle, because I want to climb down the mini ropes course, and the red tube doesn't lead to that. Then I'll run over to the seesaw and ride that with my friend. The next day, I'll start with the tire swing, but I'll turn it sideways so I can slide my legs through the hole in the middle and spin round and round like a top, rather than sitting on top of it swinging in lopsided circles. And then I'll go to the seesaw, but this time I'll sit on the other side so I can face the street instead of the school parking lot. I'll chase my friend up the giant slide because I'm not feeling gravity that day. And when I end at the jungle gym, I'll climb up the ropes course and walk the plank backward until I end up in the pirates' quarters. That's where I can steer the ship and look out over the rest of the playground. Do you see what I'm getting at? Before Everett could respond, Davis kept going. Every day, I have to play on that playground because it's the only playground my school has. That's the equipment, that's what I've got. But am I running around solo, or is it a giant game of TV tag? Am I running up the slide or sliding down it? Everything about how I use the playground is completely up to me. Nobody gets to tell me what to do. In the constraints, in the limitations of the playground, I find my freedom. Scales and arpeggios are the same way. I know the notes, and they never change, so I have to get creative. Do I slur my F minor 3-octave scale in triplets going up, and staccato and square eighth notes going down? Am I solo pianissimo in my A minor arpeggio today, or am I mezzo forte? Do I spiccato the bow in G major because it's a joyful key, and then go legato and molto adagio in F minor because it's dramatic and I'm playing Brahms in a recital that night? Davis sat back then, noticing that Everett's eyes had never strayed from his. It's very different from when I'm learning a piece, Everett. Scales and arpeggios, that's the playground. That's where I get to run and play and jump and be free. Wow, Everett said. You really took that metaphor and ran with it. Davis smiled and shrugged, suddenly bashful. Did I? Everett narrowed his eyes, but he smiled too as he did it. You've said all that before. Davis laughed. Swear to God, I came up with that on the spot. Davis watched Everett watching him as he crossed his legs, sat back, and brought his martini to his lips. They nearly closed the restaurant, and when the check came and Davis reached for it, and Everett reached faster, Davis said, But I asked you out. And Everett, with his big green eyes, glanced up as he pulled a credit card from his wallet and said nothing. When Davis started to pull his own credit card from his satchel, Everett, still staring, the movement barely perceptible, shook his head. Davis felt compelled to set the satchel down, and when he did, Everett smiled. Only then did Davis glance at his dessert plate, which still held a few bites of cinnamon apple pie. I don't even like pie, but this is so good. He sliced himself a small bite, speared it with his fork, and ate it. Then he looked at Everett again. You seem like a man of few words. He sliced another bite. Why do you say that? There was something mysterious in Everett's voice. You've been so quiet tonight. The waiter came and silently collected the check and the credit card. All the while, Everett's gaze went uninterrupted. That's more about you than it is about me. Are you saying I talk too much? Davis narrowed his eyes. Everett grinned. No, not at all. When Davis said nothing, Everett continued. I like how much you talk. I like your voice. He tilted his head to the side. So I listen. But I promise I'm not, he made air quotes, a man of few words. He blinked. I'm just a man. And then, after another few moments of silence, why? What are you thinking about? Davis closed his eyes and bit his lip. I was just... He paused, pensive. I don't think I know what that feels like. but what feels like? The waiter returned, handing Everett the receipt and his credit card, smiling at them both, thanking one, then the other. Through all of this, Everett never moved his gaze from Davis. Davis leaned in close as Everett picked up the pen. To be like, I'm just a man. What does that feel like? Everett shrugged and furrowed his brow. He glanced down to sign the check. It doesn't feel like anything, really. It's just, I don't know, it just is. Thank you.
Thank you. I always love, Thank you. I always love hearing a writer read their own work because it offers a different interpretation from how you read the work. And this is your debut novel, yes?
Yes.
And so what made you decide to write a novel? Because as someone who has written both short and long fiction, it is a different beast, similar, but different. And it can be overwhelming. So were you intimidated by the prospect of writing a novel?
Oh my God. I was so intimidated by the prospect of writing a novel. I figured out that I wanted to write, and sort of more broadly that I wanted to live in the world of words and books and storytelling right when I graduated college. I graduated in 2008 with an English degree. So I moved back home to live with my parents because the economy was terrible. And I got a job selling soap at the mall. I was selling soap at a Lush, if you know the fancy soaps and everything. Beechwood Mall, Beechwood, Ohio, had a lovely time there, working there for a year. But I had an idea for a novel when I was a junior in college and I took a workshop. And I sort of thought, oh, I'll be a lawyer. You know, I'll do something normal. And then when I'm 60 and I've made all this money, I'll retire and I'll like start a second life writing novels. And I really thought that's what I was going to do, but it was really hard to get a job. And I just started working on this other novel, and I found it insanely difficult. I sat down and I was like, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. No clue. And so I decided to try and write a short story. And I wrote a short story. It took me the entire summer. It was about 30 pages. I read it over immediately. And I was like, oh God, this is terrible. But I was like, I loved every minute of it. So I'm just gonna have to get better because this is what I wanna do. And so from that point on, I did some writing and applied to an MFA program and went to Sarah Lawrence. And I was at Sarah Lawrence when I started working on this project. And for a full year, I kept working on it and it kept growing. And it was to the point where I would send in my pages for workshop, and in their critiques, my classmates would write like novel and then cross it out and write sorry, story, because I insisted that it was a long story. But finally, I realized that I could commit to it, and that however long it took me to write, I had the wherewithal to do it. And so then I thought, well, I guess I'm writing a novel.
This novel, I believe every novel has an origin story, and in many ways, this felt like a fairy tale. And the truth about fairy tales is that while we always talk about the happy endings, getting to that happy ending can be incredibly complicated. And you might not even know that you're going to reach a happy ending. And so I would love to know about the origin story of this novel. And were you thinking about fairy tales at all as you made the composition?
I wasn't thinking about the language of fairy tales, but I was absolutely thinking of fairy tales. I knew, or I guess I should say, so that first year in my MFA program at Sarah Lawrence was a difficult year for me. My father died when I was a month into the program. It was very sudden. And I sort of went through the year in a fog. I was very productive. I wrote a lot of short stories. I got really encouraging, generous feedback on them, but I would never return to them. I would never write a second draft or do anything other than the minimum amount of revision needed to get the grade in the class. And so when I finished the program, I was like, I maybe should go to law school. Like maybe this was a mistake. But I did some summer writing workshops, and one of my teachers I did the workshop called VONA. Yeah. Yeah. this was really bold, what I'm going to say. This was bold, but it worked for me. I did this workshop, and my teacher, Evelina Galang, in our one-on-one said, "You're in the closet on the page." And that was wild to me because I'd been out for so many years. But there's a way in which she was right. And what I realized was that I wanted to try writing something that felt to me to be true to life, so that I would spend zero energy trying to convince a reader of its truthfulness. And instead, I could put all of my energy into the heart and the resonance of the work. And so what this started as, which still, like when I look back on it, I'm like, what was I doing thinking that this was close to life? Because it started as a story about a gay couple. I don't remember if they were interracial or if they were both white or both black. I don't remember any of that at the time. But one of them, their father had died, and their mother had dementia and had to move in with them, and like couldn't fully always remember what the scenario was. And all of that very quickly changed. But the point is, it almost started as an exercise for me. The other thing that I should say is that I absolutely knew from day one that I wanted to write a love story, that I wanted to write something romantic, that I wanted to take a character who, particularly at that time in gay male culture, was not a character that often was valued or seen as desirable or appreciated. And I wanted that character to kind of have the fairy tale partner. And I wanted that character to be so used to this that he was almost cavalier in handling this relationship, as opposed to sort of walking around being like, I'm so lucky to have this guy. I wanted him to be the one who had the power to potentially screw it up. That felt important to me at the time.
Well, that's one of the things I enjoyed, because typically the Davis character would be the one who people might expect to be grateful to have an Everett. Oh, you're so lucky. You have your big finance bro, 6'5", blue eyes.
Exactly.
Yes. And so to not have that dynamic was really refreshing. And it really, I think, challenges ideas around desirability, femininity, and a lot of what we see in gay culture. And it really imbued the characters, and Davis and Everett were really beautifully drawn, and they were so vivid on the page, and their love felt tangible. It felt real. And I love a good love story. And so I would love to know how you build characters and how you sustain character across hundreds of pages.
Well, I would also like to know that so that I can do it again. The truth is that this book took 14 years to write. Like it's 14 years from when I started it. So I'm a little older than probably most of you. And for me, it's interesting, not every character was developed in the same way or came with the same ease. When I first started, Everett felt so much more tangible to me. And the first sentences and scenes that I wrote were in Everett's point of view. And when I got back to school, I knew I needed to dive into Davis, and I knew I needed to dive into the Reverend. And the Reverend came very easily. And Davis came easily too, but his point of view, it took me a long time before I could get into his point of view. But I spent years in those points of views, and it was just writing and rewriting all the time. And it's interesting, I did the formal study, I did the MFA. I think MFAs are great for people who want them. I enjoyed mine. I have the toolbox, but at the end of the day, so much of the process for me is instinctual. And it's like the feeling on the page, and every reader is different and reads differently. And so my sense of my ideal reader is close to myself, not totally myself, or at least not myself now, but it's close to myself. And so I try and gauge that sort of hologram, their reactions to things. But it's just like, I write a lot by longhand. my hand, I don't know if I'm going to continue doing it because my hand gets tired more. So I don't know if I'll keep doing it that way, but I write a lot longhand, and I literally just I use a moleskin notebook, and I'm just writing each paragraph over and over and over again. And it looks crazy because there's words circled and like arrows moving things around, and and it's literally maybe 10 pages of the same paragraph before I'm able to move on to the next, which is part of why this book took me so long. But I do find that sort of sustained repetitive work really helps me figure out character. It's not so easy for me with plot, but for character, I find that I just have to try and immerse myself in it as deeply as possible. And writing longhand for me slows my brain down. So that is really helpful. I don't know. It's vibes, as the kids
Just
say.
Just vibes. I was also interested in the structure and the use of flashbacks to move the story forward. I love a good flashback. And I know some people don't, but they're wrong. And when it can propel the story and fill us in on how the characters have gotten into the predicament or the place that they are presently in, I think it can work really well. And so how do you think about structure, especially given your process, which anytime a writer tells me they write longhand, I'm just like, girl, how? I can't even write a note on a Post-it. It's too much. My hand starts to hurt. I'm just like, oh, why am I struggling? Why? It's like the peasant days. This is terrible. So I would love to know how you keep track of structure, how you think about the use of flashbacks, and also how you keep track of the plot continuity.
I mean, it's a giant mess. I will say, just, don't tell my publisher, I'm 3 paragraphs into my next novel. This is where, and I'm I don't know if I can write this longhand. I just don't know if I can do it. But the structure was actually really challenging. And one of the things for me as a writer that I'm trying to sort of work around and think through, and I'm reading up on some craft books, is that if I don't have a sense of the structure, it's very hard for me to move forward. Part of that is because I guess I can't speak for anyone else, but I kind of feel like I can, in that I don't experience time in a linear way. And I don't think any of us really do. I mean, I understand that this is the evening and this morning was the morning, and I had breakfast in the morning and I'll have dinner after. I get that. But, there is memory, and there's our pasts, and there's even vibes and sensations and traumas that live in our bodies and in our bones and in our brains. And there's dreams of the future and conceptions and things that we're hoping for. And all of these things are in us. At least this is how I move through the world at all times. And so it makes things like structure for narrative very difficult, because you're sitting there and you're thinking, all right, if I structure it this way, then that means all this has to change. And if I structure it this way, then all this has to change. And it's exhausting. And so the truth is that for me, it's a really chaotic process. I'm not a very organized person or a very organized thinker. I will probably never write something that doesn't include flashback. My first published short story was 3 pages long, and the middle page was a flashback. I just don't think I can do that. And I don't know that I'm interested in doing it, because I also love a flashback. I love to understand why characters are where they are. And there's 2 things that make me feel affirmed in this. And one is that one of those workshops I did that summer, I'm blanking on who said this, but one of the faculty members who was there, not Vona, I did another one called New York State Summer Writers Institute, which was great because they had fun. I got to go for free. They had funding for 40 people or something. I think they still do.
Yes.
Great experience, amazing faculty. But someone there was saying that the story is the thing that keeps you up at night. The story, I think they used death, and they were the story isn't necessarily what got you to the person's death. It's what happens afterwards, right? It's the aftermath. And so that is really interesting, in that idea felt like it gave me permission to lean into flashback as much as I wanted to better illuminate the moment that they're in. Because my intention was to take this moment, this relatively brief period of time. The first book is a day or so, and then the other sections are a little bit longer, and explode them. But the other thing is that Toni Morrison said years and years ago, she talked about how time wasn't linear. And I heard this on a podcast interview. And when I think she was talking about her novel Love, which I was reading at the time, I think it was that book. And I just remembered thinking, yeah, that's right. Like, we don't experience time in a linear way. So it just goes back to like, I'm trying to kind of mimic the way I think people experience the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Early on in the novel, and this isn't a spoiler, the primary tension is revealed when, on the night of Davis and Everett's wedding, Davis's father, the Reverend, dies.
Mm-hmm.
And that immediately changes the course of their marriage. And what was supposed to be the beginning of a fairy tale becomes this moment, this place of stasis for their relationship as Davis tries to grapple with grief, but also other things, which I'm not going to tell you about so that you read the book. And so it seems like it's hard to start at a place of such complication and then figure out, okay, where do I go from here? So how did you manage the challenge of beginning the story in an unexpected way? Because we expect there to be marital bliss. I don't even think they went on a honeymoon. Which, I'm just saying, Davis deserved a honeymoon. So for the sequel. But I would love to know about how you navigated the challenge of starting a novel where you did.
That I'm trying to think through the process just because it was so long, but you know, I don't write in order.
Mm-hmm.
So the beginning of the novel is not where I started writing. In part because I think all that use of flashback, I had to like understand the pasts and understand what brought them there. And so, I mean, it was really challenging. Like when I sold the book, the order wasn't completely different. Like the wedding was still the first part and the aftermath was still the second part. But it is really intricate. Mm-hmm. Who knows what, when. And so my editorial process with my editor was just like constantly moving things around, writing sort of connective tissue work. I didn't do a great job of keeping track of it in my own head. She like created a document that like organized all of it for me. And I was like, oh, like one can do this, which really, really helped me. But, you know, I knew all along that I had to show the beauty and I had to show what was good in this relationship before I began to slowly, brick by brick, begin to tear it apart. I had to try and get the reader to love their love, to root for these two characters of whom they picked up this book. And one of the things that I learned maybe halfway into the process was that I hadn't done nearly a good enough job of that. And so, you know, the first 100 pages are probably the most worked over part of the book in terms of my writing and rewriting. After I got through that, the rest of it came a little faster. But it was just kind of understanding that I don't know that all books that are sort of like this would need to do this, but for this book, I needed to build up that relationship. And that contributed to the pacing and the moments that I spent time in. And then once I realized that, it gave me a lot of freedom to, again, lean into backstory and think about, you know, the key moments that a reader otherwise might not see on the page that brought these characters to where they were. And also, you know, I love Atonement, the movie and the book. And it taught me so much about what you can do with point of view in terms of, you know, writing, giving characters the opportunity to experience the same thing, the same moment objectively, but leaning into how they experience them individually and what they see and what they understand. And so that was a really important part of how I kind of structured and sequenced the book.
In the novel, Davis is a viola player and a very accomplished one, and wins an award that catapults their career. And reading about the Davis's music and the love of music and the success and the practice felt like, oh wow, she really did her research here, and which is of course part and parcel of writing. So how do you research and then find ways to incorporate that research into your novel, because it felt so authentic? And do you play the viola?
A very dear friend of mine who was in my college string quartet may or may not be in the audience. So I do play the viola, or I did. And actually, I would love to give people tips on how to incorporate research into a novel. I did very little for this book.
Nice.
I know so much about the viola. I played it very seriously for a long time. I wanted to be a professional violist for many years. Realized when I was a senior in college that I wasn't quite talented enough to do it in the way that I wanted to do it, and pivoted. Because also, like, I was an English major. I was not a music major. Like, the writing was on the wall, right? Like, sometimes you're like the last one to know. But all that stuff, like about the size of the viola, and there's all this stuff that if you read the book, you'll learn all this stuff about the viola that's very specific to it and is different from the violin and the cello. I knew all that and experienced all of that as a player. And what I will say is that I always knew from the beginning of the novel that Davis would be a musician. And part of that was because when I first started the novel, I also was, in the first draft of it, Davis was like a sort of, like, had gone to music school but was not really playing professionally, and I was wanting to sort of do something with that. I didn't know what, but I wanted to do something with it. And so he was like dependent on Everett financially. And as I started writing through, I was like, I'm not so interested in that. Like, I'm not interested in that dynamic. Like, Davis has his own money and does not need Everett to pay the bills. And I was like, let's play with that. And that was much more fun for me. The point is, and so because of that, like, first Davis was going to play the cello. I love the cello. I kind of wish I had played the cello. Like, it's just a beautiful, mournful instrument.
It is.
Gorgeous. And I always had a little bit of envy. Then when I started wanting Davis to be more successful and be, like, I was thinking of making Davis a soloist. For that, the instrument is usually the violin. And so I thought, all right, well, I'll just make him a concert violinist, and he's like a clear soloist. And that was what I thought was going to happen. But as the arc of the novel began to reveal itself to me, and where the novel was going to go, I realized that Davis could only play the viola. Mm-hmm. And that for its very unique things that, out of most people in the literary world, I probably know more than just about any of them, unless they were a serious viola player. I was like, it has to be the viola. And once I made that decision, the music became that much more a part of the novel. Mm-hmm. And I was happy for that.
Well, it shows. And see, sometimes we do write what we know, and it works out very, very well. I was intrigued by the fact that Davis and Everett were an interracial couple. Mm-hmm. I'm always up in people's businesses, like, mm-hmm. Why did you make that choice? Mm-hmm. What about black on black love? But listen, I have no leg to stand on here. So
I will happily talk about that.
Yes, but I thought it was an interesting choice, and most choices are deliberate. And so I would love to know why they were an interracial couple.
Yeah. So, I was 25 when I started this novel, and my thinking around plot and what happens in a novel is a lot more simplistic. And also at that time, I was still, this was like my sort of beginning of trying to not worry about convincing a reader of something, but like I was still always thinking about like, oh, what's believable? And so there is the conflict that arises between Davis and Everett in its most sort of basic form becomes clear like as soon as you hit book 2. So I think I probably shouldn't spoil that, but that was like the impetus for like the conflict of the novel. this basic relationship problem between Davis and Everett that had never been a problem before. And so as I started exploring that, and I started to understand why it was happening, my feeling at the time was that I could not imagine, given Davis's background, being Black, having grown up in a religious family, I could not imagine Davis having a Black partner. And then as I thought about it, I was like, well, okay, what about like a man of a different race who's not white? I could not imagine Davis having a partner of any other color, really, that would respond to the conflict in the way that Everett responds to it. And at the time, I felt like, okay, then that means this character has to be white. Now, I am very proud of this. I am proud of the book, but I have so much more confidence in my ability as a writer now that I think if I thought through that in that way now, I might be like, okay, well, let's take on the challenge of like writing the thing in the way that is going to be more difficult, perhaps, for readers to believe, which I don't even know if that is true, but at the time I thought it was. I also was interested in just creating a love story between characters who were so different, just diametrically opposed in almost every way, physically, emotionally, culturally, just like very, very different. I was interested in that.
That's really interesting. And I spent a lot of time thinking about Everett's family because Everett's family is actually quite messy. And I'm like, whatever Davis has going on, Everett's family is a problem.
Correct.
And they don't know it. They think that they're like not the problem. And only one member of the family knows, and it's the unexpected member of the family. So I was really interested in some of the, I wouldn't say smaller details, but the more subtle details that you use to build out this world. And that's just a comment more than a question, but I was intrigued. Everett's family, sometimes I was just like, Davis is nice. Davis is patient. But one of the key things that we know from the beginning, and you mentioned that love and their love was something we were supposed to root for, which I certainly did. And they also had quite a lot of sex. And I mean that in the best possible way. And the thing about writing sex is that either you do it well or you don't. And most of us know examples of writers who can't write about sex. I'm not going to name names, but... And so you did it very well. I thought that it was very sensual and very loving. And then in certain instances, in many instances, it was just sexy. Like, let's go. What's up? So how do you think about writing sex? Because I often think about it in terms of what Alexander Chee and other writers, of course, have said, that writing about sex is giving information to the reader.
Yes.
And telling us something that we can only find out through a sexual interaction. And so how did you think of writing about sex in terms of giving information, but also creating something that was erotic and pleasurable to read?
That is such a good question. Thank you for asking, and thank you for the compliment. I was terrified to write sex when I started this novel. And like at the risk of giving TMI, when I started writing this novel, I was a virgin. So yeah. Yes. So I was terrified.
Wow.
But sex was at the core of the conflict. And so I was working on it in my MFA, and one of my teachers, a writer named Mary Morris, who has a novel coming out next month called The Red House, which is beautiful. At Sarah Lawrence, they do these one-on-one conferences every other week, and that's like kind of part of the core of the program. And so she finally sat me down in the conference and she said, do not come back in here in 2 weeks if you have not written this sex scene. You need to write a sex scene. Like, how are you gonna write this novel and be scared of writing about sex? And so I just sat down and did it. And actually that scene is revised, but is still in the book. But, and I learned so much about how to write great sex in that moment. But then of course I had to build on it and study masters. I think that what Alexander Chee says is so important. And that is absolutely at the core of how I think about writing sex scenes. It's about communicating something that can only be communicated something to the reader that can only be communicated in that moment, in that way, and through that kind of interaction. And not only is that like an idea that is, should be sort of hanging over your head, I think, when you're writing sex scenes, but that kind of thinking begins to choreograph what the sex scene is, what people are thinking, what people are saying, what people are doing, what body parts are where. It begins to shape all of it. And so it becomes, I played viola growing up. I also was a competitive figure skater.
Oh my God, I'm just like, what?
I didn't sleep much as a kid. And that was a problem. But I'm obsessed and was obsessed with Michelle Kwan. And her great choreographer was this Canadian woman, a choreographer named Lori Nickel. And they would always talk about, because, Michelle Kwan was known for her incredible artistry. And what they would always say is that if you just listened to the music, it gave you the choreography. It told you what to do. And I loved that, but I also was fascinated by the fact that Michelle Kwan, like many skaters, skated like everyone skates to Bizet's Carmen. There's just a lot of music that gets used and overused in figure skating, and people choreograph to it in very different ways. And so that can be true, but it's also unique to the choreographer and to the skater, and that was very interesting to me. And that's kind of at the root of how I think about sex scenes and anything that has a lot of physicality to it, where you have to be conscious of the bodies and of how they're working together and how they're moving. I wanted the sex to be hot and like erotic, because I felt like the reader needed to appreciate that like these two get it on and like have a great sex life, to a point. And that was important to sort of just set up. And that was where I got to Tin House in Alexander Chee's workshop, actually. And people were like, oh yeah, they don't have good sex. And I thought I'd written a hot sex scene, and I had not. And so that needed to be revised. But yeah, that's kind of how I think about it.
That's really interesting. Do you have a figure skating novel in you?
Yes,
Oh,
I do.
Yes.
I do.
Yes.
I do.
I just love any sort of fiction about figure skating, whether it's on film, television, or in books. The Cutting Edge.
Yes.
Classic?
Yes. Classic.
Yes. Okay.
Classic. Iconic. And did you read the new one by Lane Fargo, The Favorite?
Not yet,
Oh.
but I have it. And it's, first of all, a gorgeous cover.
Yeah.
Have you
incredible
read The
cover.
Favorites?
Yes.
Is it good?
It is good.
Okay, then I'm going to start reading it
It's
tonight.
good. It's addictive. Also, Lane is just a really cool person.
Okay.
Just a cool person.
In addition to writing books, well, your first book, but I know there are more coming, you are the editor at Electric Literature. And Electric Literature is a really great and well-known literary property, but that seems like a big job. How do you balance writing and editing? And does your editing inform your writing at all?
I love this question because I get to talk about Electric Lit, which I love. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. I actually found, before I got to Electric Lit, I was living and working in New York for 9 years doing nonprofit service-oriented work. I worked at the Harlem Children's Zone. I worked at an organization called Figure Skating in Harlem. And was really like working to serve the young people of that community, and was very like happy to do it. I had work that I was proud of that I could stand behind, and in theory was supposed to allow me the time and energy to write. Reader, it did not. But the bigger thing is that when I was in Cleveland for that first year after college, and I wrote that horrible short story, and said I'm just gonna have to become a better writer. Part of why I knew that this was the path for me was because, remember, I was like, I wasn't talented enough as a violist to kind of play the viola professionally in the way that I could have gone to a music school. Yes, I think so. And, I could have done it, I think, but not in the way that I wanted to do it, not with the kind of level of financial stability, I think, and the kind of prestige that I would have wanted to have as a viola player. And that made me realize that I didn't really want to play the viola, because if that felt childish to me. And when I discovered writing, I felt so humble about it. I was like, I want to write. I hope to write. That's where my heart lies. If I'm not talented enough, or if my life doesn't work out in a way that allows me to write and publish work, if I can be anywhere near writers, anywhere near books, anywhere near publishing, I will be happy to be had in that world in any way that they'll take me. And that was really how I felt. And so really the goal of my life was to become full-time literary, to be able to devote my energy just to that world and not to another world. And so I say that to say that for me it works. Like, Electric Lit is a big job. I have a great partner in Halima Marcus, the executive director, who is wonderful and has like all the institutional knowledge that I don't have, because she's been there pretty much since the inception and worked her way up from intern to executive director. And the entire staff there is great right now. For example, they're all incredibly patient with me. They're taking on extra work while I'm out promoting this book. But also, I find that being able to just have a one-track mind professionally works for me. My editing absolutely informs both my work on the page as a writer and the way that I work with people who are editing me. Because I feel like I have a unique understanding and level of trust for where their efforts are coming from. And I have I feel as though I have a unique ability to kind of recognize my limitations in the ways that I am seeing my work. And I'm very open to what others are seeing and saying and wanting to contribute to it. And I want that. And I'm eager for it. And some of that comes from having done all this editing work. So for me, it works well together. And I will just say, because EL is it's mostly writers, like the people who work there are mostly writers. I think we've done a good job of creating a place where we take everyone seriously as writers. We take their efforts and their successes as seriously as writers. People are on our staff and they get their MFA and they're able to still be on our staff. I mean, most of them are part-time. It's me and Halima and one other person are full-time, but it's just a super supportive place. And, we structure it logistically so that people have time and energy to write their work. And I would say that I crossed the finish line of this novel because I got that job. And all of a sudden, a year later, I had finished it,
How did you learn to take yourself seriously as a writer?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I ever didn't take myself seriously as a writer. I certainly knew early on that I wasn't writing work that was ready, for a reader, ready to be published, deserving of that honor. But from early on, I was just like, okay, you are going to try to be excellent. And, part of it was that I was less I struggle with this advice sometimes because we want to build a career. But the truth is that in those early days when I really didn't know if anyone would ever want to publish me, I was less interested in being published and most interested in trying to be excellent. And to be honest, I felt like I had gone through my life and had people put effort and money into me, sending me to great schools, all the viola lessons, all the figure skating. And I felt like I had never lived up to my potential in any of those places. So I also had a deep internal pressure that was this is where you've landed, so you need to do it. And so I was just serious about it from jump. And the great thing about having done this novel, having finished it and having published it, is that because of all those things, like wanting to be a professional violist in a symphony orchestra. Everyone who figure skates wants to go to the Olympics. I was nowhere near going to the Olympics. That was not a rational part of the conversation. But of course, I wanted to be an Olympian. Not accomplishing these things meant that I had a self-definition of myself as a person who quits, who can get people to believe in them and support them, and then takes that and squanders it and eventually quits and walks away. And I spent some time in therapy trying to think about why that was. But the truth was that I was never going to get over that definition of myself until I finished this novel and until, publishing was sort of bonus, but until I finished this novel and like did everything I could to bring it into the world. I forget what the question was. I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, you answered the question. Before I open it up to the audience, I would love to know, I have a question that I ask really every creative person I'm fortunate enough to share the space with. And that is, what do you like most about your writing and how you do it?
There's probably nothing that brings me more joy than just a beautiful sentence. And the tough thing is that all kinds of sentences are beautiful. And the intricate part that they don't always tell you, but that you'll figure out if I'm telling you, I guess, if you haven't figured it out, but if you haven't, you will, is that part of what makes a sentence beautiful is it in conversation with the sentences around it, right? And so I just love that work. It just brings me maybe the greatest joy in my life.
It is such a satisfying feeling, isn't it? When you're like, I put my foot in that.
Yes, yes, I
Absolutely.
did that.
And like, sometimes I'm like, girl, yes.
Yes.
And then the next morning I'm like,
Yes.
wow, I was really tired last night.
I was
Damn.
really feeling myself.
Sometimes I feel the shit out of myself and I'm just like, ugh. But most of the time I'm like, no, I put my foot in that. So
and you do.
Thank you. If you guys have questions, please don't be shy.
Oh, that's such a good question. I have a theory that when it comes to fiction, there's kind of two kinds of writers in this very big picture way. And there's writers that start very close to their experience and write away from it. And there's writers who start very far away from their experience and end up writing closer to it. And I start close to my experience. And so, just very straightforward, Davis was inspired by like a very young me. I wanted to write a character and center that character and create a story and a world where that character was just loved and valued and adored by everyone around him. And I wanted to see what that character might do with that level of agency and freedom. I wanted to write the book that little me needed to read. For Everett, there's not like one specific sort of person or source. I went to an all-boys prep school in a place called Hunting Valley, Ohio. Is correct. But there was just a lot of like those boys, their older brothers, their fathers. I was so interested in that kind of guy, but like actually making him be really decent and lovable and generous. I was interested in that because one of the things is, for as much as I say about having gone to this school, like there are people that I love that I met there and that were in that school, and I have fond memories and difficult memories. And so I'm always interested in sort of subverting what I feel like the larger narrative maybe is. For the Reverend, it was really interesting because he as a character was sort of inspired by my own father, who was also a reverend, but is completely different from him on the page. Very, very, very different people. The nature of our relationships were very different, but he was certainly hanging over my head as a specter as I was writing that character. And as I was trying to get at the deeper sort of like his decency, his love, his intelligence, and what was behind his brutality, I was thinking of my father and his background. And there's a way in which this novel is a love letter to my father.
Oh, good question.
That's a great question. I think character. I think you've got to find a way to write characters that feel distinct and that feel like they are alive, not even on the page, almost like hovering above the page, like walking around you. And I think the way to do that is to find ways to make them incredibly specific and incredibly individual. I think it's detail work. And I think when you get that detail, because the heart of a love story, I think, is really getting a reader to care about the characters and to care about what happens to them. Because if you don't care about the characters, then the love story falls flat because the love story doesn't matter to the reader. So I think it's interesting because people talk about genre writing and romance writing as though it's not character forward. And I understand intellectually that distinction, and I understand that the approach to writing might be a little different. But when I read romance novels, and I did for that, when I read romance novels, when I read mysteries and thrillers, I care about what's happening because I care about the characters. And so to me, they're still character-driven works. And so I just think character at the center of everything is like the first level. Yes, I love to talk about names. So thank you for this question. My naming process, like much of my process, is completely chaotic, and it's different for every character, and it's different for everything. So, like, okay, does anyone know the sitcom Girlfriends? Tracy Ellis Ross.
Come on.
Right.
Ask a real question.
Right. My favorite. I was watching Girlfriends last night. So in season 1, she has a crush on a restaurateur named Davis. That's where I got the name Davis. He's not in any way based on that character, but that's where I got that name. I got the name Everett because I had worked at the mall and there was a cute boy across the way working at Tivana whose name was Everett. And my sister had a friend named Everett, and I was like, I like that name. I like how that sounds. It just like worked on the ear. I'm very attuned to how words and sentences and names sound to the ear of the reader. And I say that to say that not every name came easily to me. Mm-hmm. Some of them were much more difficult. The Reverend went through many names before I settled on his name. Davis's mother, her name took a long time, and also with several different ones. The character Olivia, that name came to me very quickly and was sort of inspired by Olivia Pope. I'm a scandal head. The character is not really like Olivia Pope, I would say, in many ways, but the name, I was like, yeah, let's put an Olivia in there. But I'm very intentional about the names. But I will also say this. You don't need to know the name until the book is ready to go into print. Like, it takes the time it takes, just like with everything else with the process, it takes the time it takes. And if you don't have a name for a character yet, you can just do like a working name, like a working title, or you can write like TK or some kind of something, or you can get creative and think about a name that's not considered a name. You know, what if you use a different kind of word? What if you use a phrase? What if you use a symbol? There's so many different ways to think about it. I'm doing, with this next novel that I'm 3 paragraphs into, that is a figure skating novel and centers Black love. Black queer love. Yes. I'm doing something different for me and risky for me with naming two of the main characters, and I'm so excited about it. Like, I'm so excited. I cannot wait. And I feel like I'm like a little nervous that my agent's gonna be like, and then publisher's gonna be like, but I'm like, no, these are the names, and also these are artistic people, and this is what we're doing. So anyway, I can talk to you about naming forever, but you just give yourself grace as you should with every other part of this process. Give yourself grace, and the name will come when it needs to come, and you just keep your ears open and you listen for it, and when you need it, it will arrive.
Oh, I'm excited for this new novel, primarily for the figure skating.
Yes.
But any celebration of Black love is also exciting. Any other questions?
Yes. So I had a little bit of a unique process in all of this, in the professionalization of it. It took me a long time to write this novel, and so what happened was a really wonderful editor and writer and literary citizen named Jennifer Baker. She and I became friends in 2015, and she was working on an anthology called Everyday People, The Color of Life, which was published a few years later in Atria Books. And so we became friends. We worked in Harlem near each other. We'd met at a few events, and we were just like hanging out, getting chai all the time in Harlem. And she was doing this anthology, and I was just kind of like, man, I wish I'd become friends with her a year earlier, because maybe I could be in this anthology, because she was like paying people well, and I just like needed money. Anyway, she eventually, the anthology was almost done, and there were 3 writers where she was like, this isn't working, I'm like not gonna publish them, would you send me something? And so I sent her actually 3 short stories, and I was like, take your pick, like anything you want, like please. And I thought she was gonna pick a new short story, but instead she picked a short story that I had just published in a journal, but that was available to be reprinted, and it was an excerpt of this novel. And so getting published in that anthology was really, really important to my career, because it got into the hands of a number of book editors, acquiring editors, and they kind of, I had just made a website maybe a few years before, and so they started emailing me wanting to find out if I was working on a novel, and I was like, yes, in fact, what you read is part of the novel. And then they wanted to see pages of the novel. And so I had a couple key mentors at the time, Angela Flournoy and Alexander Chi and Morgan Jerkins.
Oh, good choice. I mean, that's a great crew.
I was very lucky. I was very fortunate. And they were all incredibly generous with me. And they said, because I was like, okay, if these editors want pages, what do? I only have like maybe 75 pages of this novel written. And they were like, get an agent. And so I was able to get an agent pretty quickly. That was a gut decision. I had, I think, 4 choices. I thought I was gonna go with the one who had expressed interest in me the longest. And then I ended up meeting with the man who I chose as my agent, and I just loved the conversation, and I felt a gut reaction that he was the person. And I've been really, really happy with him the entire time. So he waited for 4 years, did not see pages for 4 years. He would email me about once a month, sometimes like a musical theater quote, something cute, to be like let it go. Like he did that because he was like, send me this book. And so finally in late 2020, I sent him 150 pages. And I was, I didn't have a job at that point. This, was it? Yeah, it was late 2020. I didn't have a job, or I had a part-time job, and it was COVID, and I was like getting a lot of writing done. And I was like, I think I can finish this in a couple of months. And he wrote back to me a couple weeks later, and he said, I've read these pages. I think they're fire. I think you can sell them now as a partial manuscript. Initially, I said no. I said, I got an MFA. They said that, you have to have a finished book. Let me just finish the book. And then my life got complicated. And so literally a week later, I said, you know what? I'm not going to be able to finish this in 3 months. Let's see what happens. So he sent it to some editors. I was on calls a week later. No one could pull the trigger because I was a debut and no one really knew who I was. But there was a lot of excitement. And then I did get an offer a couple months later, a good offer. But I turned it down because I understood that there was a lot of interest in the book, and that if I just finished it, I would get a much better situation. And so a year and a half later, I finally finished it. I sent it to my agent. We did 2 rounds of revisions over 2 weeks, very, very quickly. He was like super on it and responsive. And then we sent it out to publishers. We sent it to maybe 26 or 27 publishers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I ended up getting a preempt from Random House, but there was maybe 5 or 6 that were in contention. That was a quick process. It was about 10 days. And then, I chose my editor because we had this incredible conversation. Like, my agent called me right after that call, and he's like, I've been in this business 20 years. That's one of the very best calls I've ever seen between an editor and a writer. And it really was a sort of magical editorial experience. I felt like she understood everything that I was trying to do and was able to amplify it. I felt like I really did some work. Like, I did structural edits on this book because it was a first draft. Some parts had been rewritten many times, but there were other parts that had never been rewritten. So I always say it was sort of a first draft. And so I did a lot of editorial work over the 2 years. And she was right by my side. And I felt like I had a partner in this work that had been very, that I had done solo and so intensely. And so that was really important to me. But one thing I do want to emphasize is that this business is kind of the Wild West. And in a lot of ways, there aren't that many rules. And so, and depending on, I don't know, your agent and different things, like the benchmarks are not always objective. And so I was ready to sell the book when we sold it because I did not know how to go any further on my own. And I knew it needed work. And I wanted a partner. I wanted someone who could walk with me through the process of making sense of this mess that I had created. Not everyone feels that way. Some people want everything to be super polished and all that. It just depends on your process and your agent and a lot of different factors, but that's how it went for me.
That's interesting. And I love hearing from different writers what their process is like, because you're right. If you talk to 5 writers, it's going to be 5 different experiences with not only the agent process, but the editorial process.
Yeah.
And it's always interesting because there's a lot of common wisdom that's not wisdom at all, and it's wrong, that editors don't edit.
Mm-hmm.
And while editors are overworked and underpaid and sometimes can't devote as much time and energy as they would like, in general, actually, I've never met an editor who does not edit.
Yeah.
And does so extensively and deeply and thoughtfully. And so that was a really great story. We have time for one more question.
And revisit the full story and rewrite it?
Oh, that's a good question. No, at that point I was in documents. And I probably had 30 different documents that were just labeled Untitled 1, Untitled 30. I could look at it and kind of look at the font size and be like, okay, that's the working document for the whole thing right now. That's the working document where I'm putting everything that's in book 1 versus book 2. It's a complete mess. And I don't know how to organize myself in that way. So it'll probably be like that for the next book. But no, the longhand, I was probably done. I finished writing it longhand in 2016 or so, 2017. And even by that point, things were typed up. I would sort of get something to my satisfaction,
Mm-hmm.
and then I would type it up because I was interested in how it would change once I did that. And it would immediately get 1,000 times better when I did that, which is probably why, again, for the next one, I don't know if I'm gonna do as much longhand. I do have the moleskin, but we'll see. But yeah.
Wow. Well, Denne Michele Norris, thank you so much for joining me here today and for writing such a beautiful love story. And it's also so much more than a love story, but I'm not going to tell you about the turn at the end. It's not a twist because it's beautifully woven to get there, but there is a turn and you have to earn it by reading all the way through. But thank you so much. And Denne, are you willing to sign their novels?
Yes,
All right.
absolutely.
So Denne will sign your books. And thank you all for coming out this evening. I really appreciate seeing your faces here.